by all means. Okay. Right, well, good evening to you all. I can't see anybody, but I assume you're all there. For those who don't know me, I'm Jim Paice. I'm the privilege of being chairman of the GWCT, the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, which, as you all know, is the foremost wildlife conservation charity in the UK, and all the research and education that we do. Now, for the first time that I've been involved with the GWCT, I seem to be involved in an event which, for a change, is not raising money. You'll all be delighted to know, although any contribution is always gratefully received. In some ways, this evening is breaking new ground for us because, as you'll all know, that we've been involved in research into wildlife and conservation and things like that for many, many years. And our research is seen as the leading research across the country and highly respected. We've, until very recently, though, not got involved in the sort of economics, or as far as this evening is concerned, the socio-economic side of the countryside, and in particular shooting. But as you all know, shooting is under immense pressure, mostly based on ignorance, some from slightly more malevolent reasons, but it's under pressure. And we need all the help and support we can get to demonstrate that shooting is a force for good in the countryside. I've always believed that to be the case. We've got all the evidence that a well-run shoot is good for conservation and biodiversity. But we've never really got into the people side of it. So tonight we're going to spend the evening looking exactly at that. The principal part of this evening, which we'll start in a moment, is a video. This is an interview with Tracey Latham-Green, who has done a PhD into the socio-economic side of shooting, and all the people, as she will explain, all the people involved with shooting, not just shooters, the beaters, the keepers, and everybody else. We'll also have with us Sue Evans, who's the GWCT director in Wales. Wales stole the march slightly on England by doing a survey a few months ago called the Community Spirit. Some of you may have seen it, which has done a survey really very similar to that which Tracey has done and will explain in a minute. And therefore, when we've seen the video, we will take questions. Anthony will deal with them, and myself, Tracey, and Sue will endeavour to answer them. When we get to that, I will explain the process. But if you want to ask questions while the video is going on, it's all going to be done on your machine. You will all see a chat box at the bottom of your screen. You will please use that. We're not going to have any live feed because of the delays and problems that causes. So if you need or wish to ask a question, or indeed pass comment, please use the chat box, click on that, and we'll all be able to see, and at the appropriate time, we will try to answer any points raised. I'm going to stop there. The most important part of the evening is the video, which Anthony's about to put on for you, where he interviews Tracey about the work she's done. Over to you, Anthony.
Hi, Tracey.
Oh, hi, Anthony.
Great to have you here. Thank you so much for joining me today to talk about your study. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, I was wondering if you could give us a bit of background on yourself and how you came to carry out this piece of important research. I know you've been working hard on it for the last few years, but give us a bit of an idea of what happened before that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, firstly, thank you for inviting me here today to talk about this, and thank you to all my participants in the research who took part and enabled me to complete the PhD in the last 3 years. So how did I get here? Well, prior to starting the PhD, I'd been working as a freelance researcher and consultant, mostly in the charity third sector for over 10 years. And then from 2013 until March this year, I worked on the board of Lincolnshire CCG, who commission health services for my local area. So I've got an interest in what's called the wider determinants of health, basically how people live their lives and what people do as leisure activities and how that impacts on their health and well-being, not just their physical health and well-being, but also their mental health and well-being. So, yeah, which is interesting. So I was completing a doctorate in business administration in social prescribing, which is where the doctor tells you to go and or suggests that you go and join a social club or go out walking, etc., to make your health better. And then my MBA tutor suggested I consider this PhD, and having no knowledge of game shooting at all, having never taken part myself, I looked up how it works and the range of people involved. And I thought, well, this looks interesting. I think there's quite a lot of opportunities for social interaction and physical activity, which would link into my research interests. And I thought it would be an interesting project to do. So I applied, and almost 3 years later, here I am now.
Fantastic. So absolutely no involvement.
Absolutely none. No, I had no idea what driven game shooting was. Had to look everything up and go and visit a couple of shoots to see what it was all about before I even started planning the study.
So hopefully we all welcomed you with open arms, and you had all positive impacts from meeting the shooting community.
Yeah, lots of nice sausage rolls and things like that.
Fantastic. So the study.
Yeah.
Understanding the social impact of participation in driven game shooting in the UK, which is quite a snappy title for a PhD study. They usually go over to like three lines, don't they?
Yeah.
So tremendous bit of work. I haven't managed to read the whole PhD, but I certainly loved your executive summary, which I understand you can get on the University of Northampton website. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And the GWCT actually did a press release in September, and they had a link to it there. And of course, I can provide a link for you if you'd like one. So if people can read it. I wouldn't recommend reading the entire PhD. I think the executive summary will probably be enough.
So this is clearly a really important bit of work at the moment, particularly for us in the political climate. I mean, there seems to be a need for field sports and the wider community to demonstrate the benefits of what we do and what our place is within society. Do you agree with that as a sort of general synopsis?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you say, there's quite a lot of political, it's quite a controversial topic, I would say, and most of the research that had been done in the past was accused of bias, either for those for or against shooting. So this particular piece of research, I tried to be as objective as I possibly could and to look at driven game shooting as an outsider, if you like.
Fantastic. I mean, yes, it seems to me that you're tackling it pretty much head on when you're dealing with the social impacts. So can you tell us a little bit about the methodology? What did you do? Who do you talk to?
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, it's a seasonal activity that involves lots of people, not just guns. So you've got beaters, pickers up. Usually I have to tell people about how driven game shooting works, but I'm sure most of your listeners and watchers know how driven game shooting works. And I was looking at the fact that although it takes part over a short part of the year, there are social networks and groups of friendships that can basically exist all year round. And as my kind of theoretical underpinning, which you need for a PhD, I was looking at something called social capital, which is basically friendship groups and identity and how these things link together. And how that impacts on people's health and well-being, particularly their mental health and well-being, which I measured using a national data set, using a recognised scale called the Short-Warwick-Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Score, so that I could compare the responses from the participants in driven game shooting to a national data set. Because of the bias nature, the controversial nature of the topic, it was very difficult to get an unbiased control group, if you like. So I needed a national data set, but I also looked at physical well-being, because obviously I saw that people do lots of walking when they're going out beating, particularly when they're doing grouse beating, really. But yeah, lots and lots of walking, as I found it myself. So it was basically what they call a mixed method study. So my first stage was qualitative, which meant that I visited a number of shoots during the October to December 2018 shoot season, different sizes, both commercial and syndicate shoots, all the way over the country, from way down in the southwest up to York, but only in England. I went out on shoot days on 7 different occasions with the people, spoke to them, talked to them about why they took part in driven game shooting, watched how everything worked, etc. And then subsequently interviewed 45 guns, pickers up and beaters in extended interviews to talk a bit more about why they took part and their reasons for going out, etc. After that, I gathered all the interview data and I analysed that using a recognised academic method of analysing interviews, and I identified some key themes, which were social capital, so the way that the friendship groups worked, how strong the friendships were amongst people within the driven game shooting community, how that was linked to identity, and then what the positive and negative social impacts were. Once I'd done that, I then designed a questionnaire, which I'm sure some of the people listening now probably responded to, because I got 2,424 responses.
Oh, wow.
Which is a lot for a PhD. And that was over the spring and summer of May to July 2019. And then I analysed them using statistical testing.
So that's really interesting. I mean, that's a huge number of respondents, isn't it?
That is a very large number of respondents, and how I got that really was using what they call snowball sampling. So I asked people to share amongst their contacts, and I also joined a number of social media groups of pickers up and beaters, and then asked them to respond to the questionnaire. So eventually I gathered more and more responses. I also had some help from GWCT, BASC, NOBS, people like that. They all shared the survey. So yeah, that was a very big data set, and I understand that it's the biggest data set that they've had for a PhD at the University of Northampton. Fantastic.
So all that fantastic information back in, yep. And then you had to the difficult task really of pulling out some information from it.
Huge amount of data that I'd gathered, and I think probably if I'm going to talk to you about some of the findings, it might be useful for me to share some slides to kind of give you an idea of what people said and what the results were. Would that be okay?
Certainly, that'd be fantastic, Tracey.
Okay. So on my first visit to a shoot, it was the first time I'd ever been. It was freezing cold. I'm wearing every single piece of waterproof clothing I own. And I thought to myself, my goodness, why on earth would anybody do this for fun? But while I was there and the time I spent on the beaters wagon, I realised that these people that were going out beating, they had a strong sense of camaraderie, and they said they took part because they were going out with like-minded people, and they really did enjoy it. In fact, this was really good evidence of strong social networks and social capital and identity and action, people working together. In fact, one of the beaters put it really succinctly in one of the interviews as to why he took part. He said, the other thing that obviously is a big attraction for myself and just about everyone I know is the social aspect, because the very fact you're doing something that isn't run of the mill means you're actually working with a group of people, all of whom have similar interests and ability. So it's a sort of natural selection process really, and why I do it when it's wet and horrible. So I thought that was quite interesting, that there were very, very strong friendships there. And in fact, in the wider survey, 91% of participants indicated that a rural identity and a connection to the countryside and rural life influenced their participation, showing how much identity is part of that. The average age of participants was around 57, and many of them were actually retired or semi-retired. And one of the key reasons that many of them gave for taking part in driven game shooting was having a purpose in retirement. And this is something that's been shown in wider research to have a positive impact on health and well-being. In fact, one of the pickers up put it very, very succinctly, I think. She said, I do think if you live to some extent on your own, as you get older and become very introspective, there can be a degree of how do I feel today? And that's bad for anyone. You know, when you have a couple of kids and you don't have time to invest in yourself and how you're feeling, I think that's a possible pitfall if you don't have enough to do as you get older. And in fact, in the wider survey, 98% of regular beaters and pickers up agreed or strongly agreed that this sense of purpose and contributing to the success of the shoot day was really important to them. And when you think about when you retire, obviously they've got an ageing population in the UK. It's important that we do physical exercise, and you could just go out for a walk. But the fact that you're taking part in driven game shooting, many of the beaters and pickers up said to me, and the guns as well at the syndicate shoots, it encouraged them to go out and take part in physical activity all year round. So one of the flankers from a Yorkshire shoot, who was in his 70s, said to me, everybody cheers you on, come on, you know, you're getting on a bit now, we all give a lot and take a lot, really. I don't rate getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning to go out beating, a great idea this time of year, you know, but when it's snowing it's even worse. But I never say no. My wife, she says, come on, you've got to go out, you can't sit around doing nothing. And that again is another kind of representation of how important it is that people have got a purpose and going out to encourage them to take part in activity. And the final thing really that kind of came out of the qualitative interviews and the visits was the fact that this hobby takes part predominantly in rural areas, which can be made up of isolated settlements. People can be lonely, there can be poor public transport. So this can be the only form of contact that they would get within the week. If they didn't go out beating and picking up, they can potentially be quite alone. In fact, one of the beaters put it quite simply. He said, I could easily go a day here where I wouldn't see anybody, and you sort of think that's not a good thing, really. I wouldn't want it to become like the norm. You don't do very much and you don't see very many people. I think that's when you become a little bit introverted and you don't sort of get yourself out there, and that's when I think you're just, you know, waiting for the inevitable. So what I really wanted to do was to see how these positive friendships and social groups could impact people, what the strength of them was, and how this impacted people's mental and physical health and well-being. So I used 3 different questions, which I asked in my survey. If I needed help, I can rely on my friends from within the shooting community. Friendship and camaraderie are key reasons for me to participate in DGS. And I've made some close long-term friends from my involvement in DGS. And people either wrote whether they agreed or disagreed or strongly agreed to those 3 statements. And you can see from the graph here that the weighting is heavily towards agreeing and strongly agreeing, indicating that there was very, very strong kind of friendship groups within driven game shooting, as I'd suspected from the qualitative interviews and from the visits. And I did some statistical testing here to see if there was any difference between syndicates and commercial shoots. And in fact, there was a slightly higher level of friendship, if you like, within syndicate shoots than there was in commercial shoots between all participants. It's just quite interesting. So then I wanted to see.
And Tracey, when you're looking at that, is that largely because you've got larger numbers of people within the commercial shoots? Are they smaller groups in the?
I don't really know what the reason is, but people would take it. It's only a small to moderate significance. It just shows that the friendship, the responses to the friendship groups and the camaraderie and the long-term friendships seem to be stronger within syndicate shoots than within people who take part in beating and picking up within commercial shoots. But that doesn't mean that there aren't strong friendships between the people that are beating and picking up at a commercial shoot. You can see it from the responses to the, to their wider question, not the wider questionnaire, to the interviews. When I spoke to people, and when you observed it in the beaters wagon at a commercial shoot, but it just means that syndicates have a slightly stronger set of friendships than commercial shoots. That's probably all that means. Both, if you look at the graph, have very strong answers to the questions relating to social networks.
Yeah, it's very heavily skewed, isn't it?
Heavily skewed towards strong social networks. So I thought to myself, what impact does this have? As I said to you, I was trying to measure that with the Short Warwick Edinburgh mental wellbeing score. So if I just show you this next graph, this is very, very interesting. So the government measures mental wellbeing through a national survey, asking people 7 questions relating to that make up a scale that gives you a value out of 35 for mental well-being. And the red line on this graph here is the average points for each age band for the national data set, which is the Understanding Society Wave 7 2015-16 survey, and that consisted of about almost 40,000 responses. And then the pink line above it is the driven game shooting participants, all participants across the entire of driven game shooting: guns, pickers up, beaters, commercial, syndicate. So the average, you can see there, is much higher in the driven game shooting participants than the national average. And I did some statistical testing. I did what's called an independent t-test to compare the national data set with the data that I collected. And this showed that there was a significant difference between the mean SW, short work Edinburgh mental wellbeing score, of the national data set and DGS participants. And it was the medium to large effect size. So that shows that there is a statistically significant difference between the wellbeing nationally on average and people who take part in driven game shooting, which is extremely interesting because it shows that there's a positive impact potentially on mental wellbeing from taking part in driven game shooting. And I feel that probably the effect of the social capital, the friendship groups, and the strong feeling of identity is a big part of the reason for that difference in score. And when I drilled down a bit further, obviously I said to you earlier that the participants' average age was 57 in my study. So I looked at that particular group, and then I split that up into syndicate and commercial shoots. And all of them, even when you look at the blue line, the dark blue line at the bottom there is the Understanding Society, the national data. And then the light blue line is people who aren't members of a syndicate. And the purple line at the top is the members of a syndicate. And the red one in the middle is the full data set, everybody together. So all of them are positively impacted. Their mental well-being is positively impacted through participation in driven game shooting. But again, the syndicates who had that slightly stronger friendship have a slightly stronger, slightly higher, not very much, slightly higher mental wellbeing score measured using the short-word Edinburgh mental wellbeing scale. I mean, there's a number of reasons for this, and one of them, of course, could be loneliness, which I also asked participants how often they felt lonely. And if you look at this particular graph, the community life survey at the top there, that's the national data set. So nationally, 5.9% of people nationally say they feel lonely often and always, whereas the people that take part in driven game shooting in my sample, only 1.2% overall said that they feel lonely often and always. So there obviously is an impact on avoiding loneliness through taking part in driven game shooting.
That's fantastic. It's sort of evidence of what I guess we see on a day-to-day basis when you're actually turning up, and it's this getting the statistics to demonstrate what you see on a day's shooting is very impressive, because knowing in most science, it's actually very difficult to get the data to demonstrate exactly what you see intuitively.
Exactly. And it was backed up. I mean, I triangulated my data between the literature review, obviously, and the what was called the qualitative stage, the interviews and the visits, and then this statistical data that I got and the quantitative figures, and it all kind of matched each other up, if you like. It all supported that story that taking part in driven game shooting has a positive impact on mental well-being measured using that short work Edinburgh scale compared to the national average. Something else that I did look at, which I mentioned to you earlier, was the regular exercise, and I just thought this was quite an interesting thing to share with your viewers. That regular exercise. So people who were going to shoots regularly, that were beaters and pickers up, walked an median average distance of about 9 kilometres every time they went to a shoot. And if they're going 2 or 3 times a week, that's quite a lot of distance. On average, the full data set's about 8k, and then regular paying guns and syndicate members, I split it down as well. So it's quite a lot of walking being done there, which also has been shown to have a positive impact on mental health and wellbeing, and of course physical health and wellbeing, in addition to time spent in green spaces, which is, again, there's been research that suggests that if you spend time outside, you do exercise outside, it's of more benefit than actually doing exercise inside, which I just think is quite an interesting fact anyway on its own. So I just thought I'd also share with you why this is important, obviously, because so what? This is the so what of it. So poor mental health in the UK costs £105 billion a year. And loneliness, if you add up the societal and health costs over 10 years per person, it costs around £6,000, a study found. There's been research to show that loneliness can increase the risk of frailty, of developing coronary heart disease, of vulnerability to stroke, and poor mental health can make physical health symptoms worse. There's also been research to suggest that if you've got a strong social network around you, you can better manage your long-term conditions. So if you've got diabetes, if you've got a strong social network around you, that can help you manage that. Another interesting figure is Public Health England estimate that lack of physical activity costs the UK £7.4 billion a year. And if you think about the regular exercise, the lower levels of loneliness and the positive mental well-being scores, that's quite a big bunch of positive impacts of taking part in driven game shooting.
And probably some of the big issues that we're really desperately coping with as a society.
Exactly. I mean, basically the UK's got an aging population. I think 25% of the population are going to be over 65 in not long time. I think in about 30 years, I think you're going to have 25% of the population is going to be over 65, and it's going to be higher in rural and coastal areas. So it is an issue. People are living longer, and they're living longer with long-term conditions. So having regular physical exercise and having those social groups to help you manage those conditions is important.
Yeah, very much so. So Tracey, were there any negative points that came out?
Yeah, I mean, there was a couple of negative issues. Well, two or three really. Firstly, there was some people were concerned about poor practice in some quarters, negatively impacting their participation in sport. So wastage, the dumping of pheasants not being used, and some people were concerned about the perception of big bad days. Additionally, there was a big concern about the conflict and the kind of the disagreement between people who were for and against shooting, and people who take part in driven game shooting. As I said to you earlier, they're predominantly older age groups, and a lot of them felt helpless in responding to the negative perceptions of their sport, if you like, on social media, because they weren't particularly adept at using Twitter or Facebook. They felt like it was very difficult to combat the negative perceptions and to get across the real positives that they saw of managing land and raising their pheasants, looking after the environment and the positive social impacts as well. So I think that was definitely, the conflict is a big issue, and I think it's a very difficult one to deal with as social media becomes more divided, if you like. It's quite hard.
I guess that's something that we're dealing with in wider society, and this is just a microcosm of that, isn't it? Really, it's the polarization, etc., and that really damages people's mental health. Yes,
it does, exactly, and people can be very concerned. I mean, when I went to the large commercial suits initially, they were quite wary of my presence there, worried that I was an anti-shoot activists, and I think they had been attacked. One of the shoots locally had been attacked, and a lot of the pheasant chicks had been released, and then of course they'd all died because they can't look after themselves because they're too small. So they were quite wary, and there were signs everywhere to not share photographs on social media. So I think it is quite difficult. I think they feel helpless as well, because when they prepare evidence, such was the case with the National Resources Wales review of the evidence of shooting over the land there, and the recommendations were made and then recommendations were ignored. And similarly, last week you had the recommendations of the grouse shooting report, the Werrity report in Scotland, and they have then now been overridden. So I think people feel a bit helpless as to how they can respond both in the moment on social media, but also, you know, we've got the evidence, we put it forward, but nobody's listening. I think that's a worry, I think, for people who take part in driven game shooting. They fear those negative perceptions of what they're doing, and the fact that they're being, you know, sidelined, and the evidence is being ignored.
Yeah, I guess this is something that minorities have to deal with on a regular basis, and a lot of the people that you talk to wouldn't necessarily consider themselves to be within the minority areas, and suddenly it's becoming very evident that they are.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of the people that I spoke to particularly in the syndicates, actually, were talked about connections to their heritage and how they feel that it's part of their life, if you like, their intangible heritage is taking part in shooting. Their fathers did it and their grandfathers did it, and they feel like that's being ignored, and there's very, very little response to the evidence of the positive benefits of their pastime, if you like.
Yeah. So can you summarize it? Can you summarize the? Yeah,
sure. I mean, if I just give you a little bit of a summary of basically the positive impacts, really. So participants in driven game shooting felt a sense of belonging, basically, and strong identity, which created strong social friendship groups, which we would call bonding social capital in academia. And taking part gave them a purpose. It encouraged participation in exercise. This in turn had personal impacts, positive personal impacts on them. It had positive impact on their mental health and well-being, and reduced the reported levels of loneliness. As I said to you, there was a greater impact in the over 55s, particularly with syndicates that had the stronger social networks. And it also encourages people to go out and do physical exercise, which, as we've discussed, is important as we get older with long-term conditions and the population ages. We need to keep healthy. And what are the wider impacts to society? Well, I've shared with you some of the costs of mental health and people being lonely, and the potential impacts on physical health. Obviously, if you do regular exercise, that helps you keep your mind and body healthier for longer. And as I mentioned, long-term condition management. If you've got something like diabetes, it can save a lot of money if you manage your condition well, and being part of a strong social network and a strong community can actually help you do that. So the key thing from my research is it provides an ability to make evidence-based policy decisions to support everybody within the UK, not just urban society, I would say. And I think that some of the negatives that we covered, the fact that this kind of evidence is being ignored, is something that does need to be dealt with by policymakers to make sure that they're looking at the evidence and considering everything before they make changes that could potentially have negative impacts.
Thank you, Tracey. So where to now then?
Well, I mean, I have done a little bit of work for the Uplands Partnership, looking at how integrated moorland management impacts communities in the English uplands, and I found some interesting results there around the 6. I worked with Professor Simon Denny on that project, and we found that there was a whole range of social and intangible impacts that had potential benefits to mental and physical well-being and community cohesion. And there were 6 levels of economic impact, including things like tourism and contractors and indirect benefits of things like tick management. So that was quite an interesting study. And then I don't know, where next? Who knows? After that, I guess as good as mine.
And how can we help? How can we help, Tracey? How can all of the viewers help you going forward?
I think probably to help me and to help yourselves, actually. I think there's a few things. Firstly, it's really important that you carry on doing the great work you're doing in terms of environment and helping people who are lonely and the community. In terms of environmental practice, I understand that GWCT have got like a short test that allows you to get accreditation for your shoot based on the environmental impact. And I think that's free, and it's based on that book, The Knowledge. And I think that they're also doing a biodiversity net gain tool, which would be something for you to look into if you run a little shoot. So carry on with the great work. But it's also really important that the wider areas of concern of the public are recognised. So I would say supporting the industry with their ambition to get rid of lead within 5 years is somewhere that you can really help, is to try and not use lead where you can. And also make sure that there's no wastage of quarry meat from shooting. So do make sure that everything that you've shot gets used and doesn't get chucked away and left at the side of the road. I'm sure that nobody listening here does, but if you see bad practice, you know, tell people don't do that, because it could have a negative impact on us. But in terms of publicising the positive benefits of shooting, I think if you've got time, please do read my executive summary. I wouldn't advise that you read the PhD, because it's far too long and far too full of statistical and academic jargon. But the executive summary contains everything that you really need to know to understand the real findings of this study. And maybe write to your MP or publicise it wherever you can. Talk about these positive impacts for which there is statistical scientific evidence now. And if Anthony can, I don't know how you contact the people that take part in this this webcast. I can provide you with a link to somewhere where the executive summary can be downloaded.
Certainly, we'll definitely do all that, and thank you very, very much, Tracey, for all the work that you've done, and for choosing our pastime as your academic interest.
You're welcome. Thank you all for taking part. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had one. So nothing at all without my participants. So thank you very much.
Okay. I hope you can all hear me now. That was marvelous. I actually saw the video a few days ago and was hugely impressed, and seeing it again only reinforced that view. So I think we all, as is quite clear from seeing all the chats that have gone on in the last half hour or so, lots of you, if not all of you, immensely impressed by Tracey's work. So thank you, Tracey, not just for what you've done, but for going through it in such a clear way. I mean, those statistics are extremely useful because they probably prove what many of us who've been doing this for umpteen years all would expect. But nevertheless, the fact that you've put them in, done it scientifically, and can produce the evidence to prove a supposition is hugely valuable. And we need to make sure, as some of you have said in your chats this evening, that we use that wherever possible, alongside, of course, the work that has been done in Wales, which I'll come back to in a second. You started by, Tracey, by saying you got lots of sausage rolls. You didn't mention, but I trust you got some sloe gin alongside it, the sausage rolls. It'd be a poor old shoot if you didn't. What it showed, though, through the statistics is that shooting is good for you, whether you're a gun, or even more so it appears to be if you're a beater or a picker up, which I think demonstrates the size of the shooting family, contrary to what some of our opponents think. It's not just a bunch of toffs turning up and blasting off at poor little birds and driving away in their smart new Range Rovers that may apply to a handful. Which brings me to the negatives that you mentioned. And I think most of us do understand there are negatives that we need to address. The lead thing, as you rightly say, all the shooting organisations are trying to address. We've already said we want it phased out in 5 years. It's been a very abbreviated shooting season this year, but I've only used steel, and I personally can't see any difference. Some people say that may relate to my shooting, but so be it. And the issue of poor practice and wastage and the big bags are very much to the fore in our many of the internal discussions that are taking place. I'm going to turn now to questions. Anthony, you've been watching the chats. I'm going to ask you to read out one or two questions that we can then bat around amongst ourselves.
I just picking up the first question I picked out was, I'll just read it out. Driven game shooting is of its nature a very social activity where a large number of people are involved in each shoot. What results do you think you might get for other forms of shooting? Rough shooting, pigeon shooting, wild fowling? I guess the real point from that question is the more individual activities.
Tracey.
I don't know is the answer to that. I mean, I specifically looked at the friendship groups and the number of people involved, having strong groups together, and and going out regularly with people. I suppose if you had one or two other people that you went out with, you may have similar results. Because I wasn't focusing on the individual rough shooting, walked up shooting, I couldn't tell you what the results would be. I wouldn't like to prejudge it. But I think if there's a social element to something, some kind of activity, I did see that somebody else asked about walking together and rambling and things like that. I think if there's a social element to the activity, I think that that's probably my supposition, looking at the research and the background data and in my literature review, is that the reason why driven game shooting has such an impact on people's mental well-being is because there's such strong friendship groups and links to identity. And if the links to identity are linked to your participation in rough shooting or walked up shooting, that may well have an impact. So that would be an interesting piece of research for somebody to do.
Thanks, Tracey. Anthony, next question.
Tracey, an insightful piece of work, thanks. Can you comment on how these wellbeing results compare to wellbeing indicators for other shared countryside activities such as rambling, volunteering? I guess you've pretty much already alluded to a little bit of that.
I did try and find comparative statistics for other countryside activities when I was doing this, but there aren't really any standard data sets for things like that. But I suspect, as I've just said there, if there's a social element involved, you may well get the similar kind of outcomes. But again, you could perhaps repeat the study and do it in the same format, but in a different setting, using ramblers or something, and then you would find out what the difference was.
Anthony?
How does this research affect the need to get more young people involved in these communities, especially with mental health being so poor within younger people?
I think an interesting thing that lots of the participants said on the qualitative stage is that it's an intergenerational activity. So there's not many activities nowadays where people from the age of 7 to 97 will get involved in a day outside. So I think it's a very good way to maintain relationships between people of different ages and get people out, get them together, and get young people and old people all across the board involved in a community-based activity that has a positive impact on their mental health and well-being. There's an interesting thing actually as well, intergenerational mixing, part of the wider PhD, which I didn't put in these slides. There's been some work that shows that if people have good intergenerational relationships, that also has a positive benefit on people's health and well-being. So that's another reason why being together in all different age groups is positive.
Anthony?
Do you think you might get the same wellbeing scores or even higher ones?
What if I did it again?
Yeah.
In what context?
I guess that's a difficult one. Let me dig through. That's from Graham Downing. Based on
in terms of COVID, or do you think?
Some of the outcome must be related to the fact people are engaging with the same people time and time again. So that's basically the reason that I think that people have come up with these positive wellbeing scores is because they are going out with the same group of people over and over again, whether they're working on a commercial shoot, they're in the same beaters wagon, they see the same people every week, whether they're in a syndicate when they're going to the same syndicates in the same area. They've built these relationships up, whatever their role, picker up, beater or gun, because they've got those strong social networks and they're doing something that a lot of them think is part of them, is part of their identity. That strengthens those friendship bonds. And then that in turn has a positive impact on people's mental well-being. And because they're going out and doing exercise, they're in the fresh air, that also probably has a positive impact, as does the fact they've got a purpose. So it's a very complex mix. But I think the root of it is the friendship groups and the companionship that you get from it. Have you got anything to add to that, Sue? Because I know your report was very strongly based on groups and mixed age groups and a lot of that kind of stuff.
We asked the question broadly. So we asked anyone who is involved with shooting, game shooting, and the responses that we got were very similar to Tracey's, which you would expect. The reason that we went about this is that we were over the moon that Tracey had produced a piece of science that we could use to present. But as usual in Wales, there's always the question of, does this apply to Wales? So we were very pleased to be able to demonstrate, and our report is purely in the words of those who actually responded, the 581 people that responded to us, and they came back with some beautiful pieces which highlighted exactly what Tracey is talking about. So it's you know, it's really quite touching to read what people have said about this, and I think that is the thing that will hopefully carry what Tracey has done and what we're doing, along with the fact that what she's produced is science-based.
I guess that's why I was excited to have you tonight, Sue, is because it's almost like you're building on top of Tracey's hardcore science and saying, look, this is something a bit more bite-sized that we can take to policymakers, and we can say, look, this is stuff you guys understand. I know you don't necessarily like the graphs and all of that kind of thing all the time, but here, bang, you can get individual people and individual stuff. Have you had a bit of a success there from a policymaker point of view?
It's really difficult to say. It's very early days yet, and everyone is so focused on COVID and other elements, but we have an election coming up in May, and we're very much hopeful that this will at least influence the strategies and the policies that they're proposing coming forward on this. It's been greatly received from the people who've responded to us, so very much welcome from that point of view.
Fantastic. I think we've lost Jim at the moment, so I'll kind of slip into the chairman's seat. So let me see if I can pick another couple of. Oh, Jim's back. That's good news.
My apologies. My broadband went down completely for some reason.
Question from Andrew Knight.
So I've got a question from Andrew Knight here. Is to what extent do these benefits extend to the wider rural communities and the pubs and hotels, etc.? I know a lot of the economic side of the social economics have been discussed in the past. And is there anything in the report that you looked at there, Tracey?
Not in mine directly. No, I was specifically looking at the individuals involved, so individual participation and how those people were impacted by taking part in driven game shooting, whatever their role, not just the guns, because a lot of the other studies have been around money and economy and things like that, communities, pubs and hotels. So my study was not looking at that. My study was looking at social impacts and looking at how that affected the person. But as Simon's just said, that on the study that we just did on the communities in moorland areas where grouse shooting takes place, we found there were above average levels of well-being in those communities compared to the national average, which we did. So yes, there was higher levels of well-being and there was a higher sense of belonging in those communities. But in terms of the actual costs and knock-ons to rural communities, pubs and hotels, as other reports have done that in a far more comprehensive way than I have. This is specifically social impacts.
Yeah, I guess they're quite well linked though, aren't they? Because I mean, you know, if you're down the pub afterwards having a chat and that keeps the pub from closing, and that's a prop that keeps the community going, then it's all very interlinked, isn't it?
I mean, sure. I mean, I've got, when I was in the qualitative stage, when I was going out visiting the shoots, you know, went to the shoots, we went to the shop and bought some stuff in the morning, when we bought some bits and pieces. And then after particularly the syndicate shoots, we go to a pub and that would pay for things, or they'd have a caterer in doing the catering, and the bigger shoots would be providing food and there'd be other people involved. But I haven't, in actual terms of evidence base, this is not within my PhD, but the actual, while I was there, because obviously you can't analyze everything, you know, you've got to write, a PhD is like looking at the head of a pin, so you've got to look at something very, very small. But when I was out talking to people, there was evidence of that, you know, spending in the local pubs, the people that were getting paid. Somebody else was asking about getting paid as a beater and picker-upper. I didn't analyse because lots of people didn't get paid. Sometimes they got paid, sometimes they didn't, sometimes they were volunteers. It didn't seem to make any difference at all. They still enjoyed it. So I think that, yes, there will be monetary things, but other research has covered money a lot more. And this is the first study that's covering the impact on people, the social impact themselves taking part.
And the most important element from our point of view with the Future Generations Act is well-being.
Yes,
and it is the work that you've done, Tracey, on actually monetarising the cost to the government on well-being in rural areas. And that is monumental when we're talking to politicians.
Yeah, sorry, Jim. When your broadband dropped out, we moved on to politics and politicians, and I don't know whether that was intentionally that your broadband dropped out there.
That's right. You obviously have brought Sue in because I was just about to do that. But have you had a chance to discuss Sue's work at all? Sue, would you just like to, if you haven't during my absence, if you haven't already said a word or two about your work?
I think I've said a little bit about it, but it has come about really because of the political pressure in Wales. We ended up with a situation where shooting was banned on Welsh government-owned land, as Tracey referred to earlier, and now Welsh Government and NRW are doing a complete review of everything relating to shooting in Wales. The impact of this and the threat with the Labour government, understandably, in Wales is significant, and therefore with us having the Future Generations Act in Wales as well, which focuses on 7 wellbeing elements for our future generations, then this is imperative for us to get a wider message across than purely what we have been talking about. From our point of view, it has been the evidence and science behind the conservation, and we have got evidence, as Tracey has referred to, on economic, but there has never been anything which is talking about individuals and their well-being. Thank
you. Anthony, I'm conscious of time. Are we tied to 8 o'clock, which is when this was supposed to end, or can we run on a bit?
We're not. I'm sure there's no problem from my side of running on.
Have you got some more questions to ask them?
I haven't actually. We've pretty much nailed all the way through it. The only thing that I've got a question for you, Jim. What? It's the kind of one that I pushed at Sue, and it was about how success of this kind of stuff when you're influencing policymakers, and I guess that sits in your wheelhouse really. But it's just how do we package this? How do we package this to get the biggest hit when it comes to talking to policymakers?
Well, it's a very good question, and as Tracey referred to earlier, we have 2 recent examples where policymakers have completely ignored the evidence, and in the case of Scotland, ignored the report that they commissioned, or the conclusions of that, the Werrity report. But it is nevertheless very important that we produce evidence. It's not just politicians, but it's the civil servants too, because a minister can have I won't say a good idea, it might be a bad idea, but an idea. It may even be in a party's manifesto, and they go along to their office and say to the officials, well, we need to do this. And if the officials have been really well briefed, then they might say, well, actually, Minister, do you realise if you do this, you'll do that? The unforeseen consequence could be this. Well, perhaps that would be a foreseen consequence, but nevertheless, it's important. And the one I always use is that if shooting were banned, the countryside would be worse off. There'd be less wildlife rather than more. This work of Tracey's demonstrates quite clearly that well-being in the countryside would suffer too. And that is a very important evidence, whether you use it with ministers or with civil servants or both. And indeed in the public domain. I mean, I'm sure many people will be very surprised to see much of this evidence of Tracey's simply in the public domain, because we have to win the argument out there. The line that we're all using more and more is that we have a social license to shoot. yes, it's lawful, and arguably everybody can do anything that's lawful, but it could equally become either unlawful or so restricted it became impossible. But it's done so because a social license, which effectively means that the vast majority of people really don't give a damn one way or the other. They tolerate people doing things they don't like because they probably do things that other people don't like, once you get away from those who are vehemently opposed to us. But we have to make sure that, firstly, our house is in order, but secondly, we've got the evidence to justify what we do, to continue to justify that social license. That's a long answer to your question, but the short answer is evidence is very, very important. Ministers get loads and loads of individuals and groups, organizations who go along with opinions. But if you can go along with clear evidence, such as we've seen this evening, it counts a lot more. And that's important. Tracey's just put up another chat, which is great. I just wanted to
Sorry, somebody asked me if I was given a brace of pheasants to take home. And I did actually get some given to me that were ready prepared for the oven on a tray, which is exactly like I like them, with some bacon and full cooking instructions. And I believe the person that came to me is on this today. And I cooked them and gave them to my children, and they said it was like turkey, chicken and turkey mixed together. So pheasants have now been called turkey in my house. That's what they are.
I don't care what you call them, as long as you eat them. That's the best thing, as you rightly said in your on the video. I was going to ask you a much more light-hearted question, because at the beginning you said you knew nothing about it. Mm-hmm. You'd never been on a shoot or anything like that. So what made you choose the subject?
Well, as I said at the beginning, I'm very interested. I work in health and well-being, and I'm doing that now. I'm still working in health and well-being. So I'm very interested in the wider things that people do and how they impact on people's health, both physical and mental. And I was doing a DBA in social prescribing, as I said, which was looking at that. And then I saw my MBA supervisor said to me, have you looked at this PhD? Because driven game shooting sounds like it's something that might cover what you're looking at. So I looked at it, looked at how it worked, and thought, yeah, this is like a group activity. There's lots of people involved, friendships, social networks, and there's also a lot of walking. So there may well be an impact on well-being. That's how I picked it.
So it was a suggestion from your tutor?
It was a suggestion from my MBA tutor, who was
MBA.
not here today. So not this one, but somebody who I knew, who I was trying to get a reference from for something else.
That in some ways that answers a question that Bruce Russell, our director in Scotland, asked in the chat room earlier about doing this in Scotland, because if that's the way we should try to encourage a similar sort of study done up there. Perhaps Bruce, you should talk to some universities and see if you can sow the seeds in some of the Scottish universities.
We actually have a young lady with us today, Natasha Coleman, who is doing her PhD on something similar but different. So you might want to get in touch with her, because she's right at the very beginning of hers.
Okay, good. Anthony, have we got any other questions that we can pose at this stage, or shall we?
We got a lot of ones just come in saying, given your conclusions of your great report, has the impact of COVID had a greater impact on those involved with driven game shooting than the wider society? There's a guess for you.
I don't know. Because I haven't done the research simply, but I suspect I did do a short survey and asked some people. I haven't analysed the data yet, and I won't have time to do so. So, when I've spoken to people, and people have written back to me that saying that they're still contacting people from their group. So I suspect, because they've got friendship groups, as long as those groups and those syndicates, as Professor Denny said, that they were having a WhatsApp group for their syndicate and they're in Facebook groups, as long as those continue outside the season, they should maintain those friendships. But that would be yet another interesting topic for somebody to take up and research. Are people who are involved in driven game shooting, have they maintained those friendships, and has that resulted in a greater support network during COVID? That would be an interesting study to do.
Anything else, Anthony, that's looking this week? I see there's quite a lot of things on the chat room, but I'm not actually.
No, I think with there. There's a few more. Natasha's
yes, I saw
also
that.
Plugging her work, which is fantastic work. Hopefully, if Natasha, if you get in touch with me, then I will try and put something together in the package that we send out to everyone afterwards, just introducing you to everyone that's been involved, if that would suit.
Okay, she says thank you. Right, well, I think probably we should draw things to a close. First thing, it came up, it was a question earlier on. Are these slides that Tracey used going to be available to anybody?
I can get them. I can send them to Anthony. I can send them to you, and then you can send them out if you'd like.
That would be great if we could make them
helpful.
available, because I think several people would like them.
Yeah.
And the executive summary, it should be available on the Game Concert GWCT's website. Jeremy Payne's on this call, and I'm going to say, Jeremy, can you make sure it is still on our website, please? Ask Andrew to do that if it's not still on there. I haven't checked myself, but we'll make sure the link rather is on, not the whole report. The link is on the website, so people can get it off our website. Right.
I was Jim. I was going to send out with a package at the end. I was going to send out copies of that. Just a PDF copy attached with the links to the videos and all of that lot. So please, everyone, send that round.
Even better, although Jeremy's just, as I would expect, of course, agreed to do what I asked. But thank you very much. If you get 2 copies of the executive summary, it just shows how important it is. Right, can I start by thanking Anthony and all his colleagues, Charlotte and others, for making this evening possible, because it is something completely different to that which we've normally done, any county or groups of counties. And as I know was the plan, there have been people dialing in into this from all over the UK, which is great. So thank you to you, Anthony, and everybody else for making it possible. Thank you, Sue, for joining us from Wales and for talking about the Welsh study. But most of all, Tracey, thank you so much for everything, for being with us this evening, both on video and live, and for the work that you did, which is so important, as I hope I've emphasized, and which if you've been looking at the chats or have a chance to later, demonstrate just how well it's gone down with everybody who's been on this call. So thank you so much, and we wish you well with your future endeavours, and obviously you're tied up with the NHS at the moment, which we all understand and fully support. But thank you indeed.
Thank you very much.
Finally, a thank you to everybody who's been on the call. And next time we'll probably be asking for money, but tonight you got off without it. Thank you all very much. But please go away with these messages and promulgate them wherever you possibly can. Shooting matters not just to the countryside, to wildlife, but also to our social welfare and our well-being. And the more we can get that message across, the better. Thank you all very much indeed. Good night.